Welcome, everybody. I'm Dr. Mike Bell. I'm the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's great to see all of you here tonight for the Mason Lecture Series. I would note there's seats right up front there, folks. It's always great. Don't be shy. Before we launch into the program, though, some important recognitions for those here in person, but also an acknowledgement of those at home. Any World War II veterans, home front workers, or Holocaust survivors in the audience this evening? Well, if not, let's give those at home a round of applause. Thanks for your contributions. Next, I'd like to recognize any veterans or current active duty service members of our armed forces from any era. Would you please stand and be recognized as well? Thanks. And of course, my favorite, any family members of veterans or active duty. You know, as they said, the toughest job in the Army is the Army wife. So thanks for your support and service as well. My hands to work here. So a couple other recognitions. I'd like to also recognize our Patriot Circle and charter members tonight. Amongst them, we have one of our trustees, Robert Priddy, and his wife, Kiki. And, thanks you to all the trustees and Patriot Circle members, charter members. Without all your generous support, none of the programs we do, like this one tonight, would be possible. So, charter members, let's give all of them a round of applause. So also in tonight's crowd, we have our fellows from our 2023 Summer Seminar in Military History, a program that they used to run at West Point when I taught there, hate to say it, 30 years ago. They're in the midst of an intensive 3-week seminar learning about the content and the teaching of military history to take that back to colleges and universities. And with us tonight, we also have a welcome to high school students from around the country that are here at the museum for the Student Leadership Academy. So let's give those two groups a nice welcome as well. So tonight's program is the latest installment of our General Raymond D. Mason Jr. Distinguished Lecture Series on World War II. The Mason Lecture Series is devoted to the legacy of America's largest war. Now, past speakers have included writers, scholars, distinguished members of the armed forces, journalists. The lecture series is open to the public, as you can see, and that's through the generosity of the late Major General and Mrs. Raymond D. Mason, Jr. and the Raymond D. Mason Foundation. Now, General Mason served, he wasn't a general then, but he served in the European Theater of Operations during World War II in the 4th Armored Division, part of the 3rd U.S. Army. Now, prior to retiring from the military in 1976, he also held several high-ranking Pentagon positions. Poor guy, but haven't been there. I can picture that. But tonight's Mason Lecture features Dr. Michael Neufeld, who will be speaking about the life and legacy of the famous German scientist Wernher von Braun. Now, I should note, for those who peeked ahead, this fall we'll open our Liberation Pavilion with 16 more galleries. One of those features a cameo there on Operation Paperclip, which you'll hear some of that this evening, and if not, it'll be subject to your questions. Dr. Neufeld retired in 2023 as the senior curator in the Space History Department of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. He holds 4 history degrees, including a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. He has published numerous academic articles and has written or edited 9 books, including The Rocket and the Reich, Von Braun and Spaceflight, A Concise History. Now, interviewing Dr. Neufeld tonight will be one of our own, Dr. Jason Dawsey. Smile, Jason, there he is. He's a research historian in the Jenny Craig Institute. Jason received his PhD from the University of Chicago and previously held teaching positions in the University of Southern Mississippi, University of Tennessee at Knoxville, He joined the Institute as our Defense POWMI Accounting Agency Fellow, but is now a research historian that specializes in studies on the Holocaust, resistance, and European intellectual history, and a pretty eclectic expert. But with that, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the stage Jason Dawsey and Michael Neufeld. All yours.
Thank you, Mike, and it's great to see everyone here on a blistering hot June day. And Mike, it's great to have you here. We have been talking about having Mike Neufeld here for a couple of years, and so excited that it's all worked out despite the pandemic slowing us down. We've been able to make this work, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation, Mike. So the figure we're talking about is hardly someone unknown in the U.S., but your biography from 2007, Von Braun, Dreamer of Space, Engineer of War, really complicates the image that often prevails of him. So let me just begin by asking, maybe stating the obvious. There's a vast literature on Von Braun already. So could you tell us how you came to write a biography of him, knowing there was all this other work out there on him, and how your approach to his life differs from these other monographs?
Right, and I thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you to the museum and to the Institute for inviting me to do this. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So the backstory is that I was a space buff in the 60s, so you can see from the hair, I'm not that young, and I grew up in Western Canada, actually, but I followed the space program intensely in the 60s, so I was a space buff. I have never stopped being a space buff. And as a result of that, I wanted to become an engineer, or an aerospace engineer, and a scientist or something, and none of those worked out, and I sort of fell into history. Mostly because I was good at it, as opposed to science and engineering. I didn't turn out as well as I thought I was going to. And to shorten a very long story, I ended up getting a PhD in German history, specializing in social and economic and labor history. And in the middle 80s, I had kind of finished the PhD, and I was feeling dead-ended about what I was doing at that time, and I was looking for a new topic. And then I hit on this idea of working on the German rocket program, partly because of the articles being published by a man who soon became my colleague at the Air and Space Museum. And so I started looking around in sort of 1986, 87, at what I could do, and almost immediately it became clear that what was written about Von Braun was poor. It was not well researched. It had no historical foundation. It was basically hero worship. And so there were a few biographies, none of them very good, and they were all about hero worship. And as I started working on this thing in the later 80s, I got a fellowship at the Air and Space Museum, and I started working on the biography, and new things were published, but I think the bottom line I have to say is that because of the revelations of the concentration camp inmates used in the V2 program and so forth, opinions about Von Braun became ever more black and white. There were people who saw him coming out of the space race in the 60s in Apollo as our space hero. And there were people who saw him as a Nazi war criminal. And the objective of my book was basically to try to bring all of this together and unite these narratives and see him as a complicated person, not as a stereotype of good, bad, hero, villain, but to try to see him in the complexity that he is and show that he had multiple sides. And ultimately, here's a guy who could be simultaneously a space hero and a Nazi war criminal. And effectively, he's a bit of both.
Yeah, if anything, Mike, your biography really does show this complexity of von Braun, and I think the questions here as we go through them, I think the audience will really be able to also get a sense of this. So moving directly to his life, to Wernher von Braun's life, whom you term, I want to make sure our audience knows this, you're very clear that you term him a rocket engineer, not a rocket scientist. We'll say more about that later. But what do you think is important for us to know about his background and early years?
Well, you know, we have a few pictures from my book, so let me just advance to this thing. But, you know, he was raised in a Prussian aristocratic family. He was actually, literally a baron. He was a Prussian baron. In the German aristocracy, every child inherited the title, unlike in the British aristocracy, only the oldest son did. So he was the second son here. He's the younger one on the right, in the right-hand on that picture on the right. He was born in 1912 in a small city or a small town in Prussia, where his father was the head of the county, county administration. So he grew up in a very traditional, conservative, aristocratic world of Imperial Germany, which fell apart as a result of World War I. And to make a long, complicated story short, you know, he was raised mostly in Berlin in the 1920s, rather than following, and he was a very unconventional, so Junker. So in German, you know, in German they call these sort of Prussian landowning aristocrats Junker, with the kind of overtone of being reactionary, anti-democratic, and militaristic, and very much committed to Prussia and the king and Kaiser. Well, you know, he turned out to be a rather unusual member of this class, because he became fascinated with technology. And in the 20s, as a teenager, he became infatuated with spaceflight. And that was the first era, basically, where space travel was really discussed as technologically feasible. Several people had published in works that were had a big impact. Notably in German, Hermann Oberth had published a book called The Rocket in Interplanetary Space in 1923, and that argued how a technology to send something into space could actually feasibly be constructed. It wasn't just going to be a science fiction fantasy, but it was actually possible. And so he became infatuated with that, which fed into his desire to be an engineer. So his real aim, he is one of these classic stories of, he was a very talented person who was not very good student and was lazy and skipped out on classes and didn't do his homework. And as a result of this, he sort of reformed his interest, became as serious about math and science, and graduated early in 1930. And he went into engineering school. So his first objective was to become an engineer, which is, as I said, a very unusual occupation for a member of his class. So to come back to the rocket engineer thing, honestly, I hate the term rocket scientist. I think it's stupid. Because rockets, I mean, there's a bit of science that goes into it, basic science that goes into it, but fundamentally it's an engineering challenge. How do you create a technology that works and doesn't blow itself up or burn up or crash? You know, it is an engineering challenge. And even though he ended up getting a PhD in physics because of the sponsorship of the German army, you know, he spent his whole life as an engineer, effectively, or as a manager of engineers.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, this point about he's a rocket engineer and not a rocket scientist. I mean, the subtitle of the book, or part of it, is An Engineer of War, and you really talk about how so much of his adult life, he's you know, what he's doing is working for either the German or later United States military. So doing the first part of that, like we're now into the 30s, kind of the late Weimar years and beyond. So could you take us to these decisive years for von Braun, 1932 to 1937, how he started to work for the German army, his attitude, and this is something that's really important your book shows, what is his attitude to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party during this initial phase of the Third Reich's history?
Yeah, so here, up here on, I guess on the left of the picture, you see a picture of him he came back to Berlin in 1930 after taking his high school degree in German equivalent Abitur. And he got involved with this Berlin rocket group, and this is kind of the origin of a Berlin rocket group. Hermann Obert is actually standing in the middle in a dark sort of long coat here. And he got involved with this amateur rocket group in Berlin, the Raketenflugplatz, and he was trying to do this engineering degree at the Berlin, what now is the Technical University of Berlin. But in 1932, he was diverted by the Army into working on a dissertation on rocketry at the University of Berlin, officially through the physics program. And part of it was that the Army was trying to sponsor technologies that might be interesting for the future. There was a group inside the Artillery Development Group, headed by Karl Becker, who later was the head of German Army Ordnance. They wanted to develop a rocket as a long-range missile. So from the very outset of the German rocket program, the objective was to build what we would call now a ballistic missile, to lift a warhead. And in fact, Becker's vision basically was to launch a surprise attack at the beginning of a war. So von Braun was drawn into this. Now, I would say his attitude to this was, number one, I mean, he was a kid at this point, like 20 years old in 1932, but he saw the limitations of this, especially in the context of the Great Depression, impoverished rocket group. The Army had money, there was a future in this, so, the money was there to maybe do something, however modest at that point. I mean, the number two reality is, he came from that class. So German, the Prussian officer corps was drawn a lot from his class. And so, although he was an unconventional member of that class, he certainly got more approval from his family for having and being involved with the Army than in this crazy rocket space business. He just migrated into it just before Hitler came to power. He transferred to the University of Berlin, and they started funding his dissertation. He wasn't employed in the Army at that point. He was just being funded by the Army to work on his PhD dissertation, experimenting with liquid propellant. The key thing here is liquid propellant rocketry. Obert and the others had sold the idea that the limitations of existing solid propellants were never going to get you into space. You had to develop liquid propellant rocketry to do that. And so, to sort of get back to your further questions about his attitude to the Nazi regime, another part of how he became, how he got this support from the Army may have been, this is not entirely clear, was that in the summer and fall of 1932, his father had been made the Reich Minister of Agriculture in a very right-wing conservative government that was created with Army support. So the Weimar Republic was in deep, deep crisis. It was obviously, as we know now with hindsight, on the verge of collapse, the verge of being taken over by the Nazis. But the Nazis and the communists were literally fighting street battles. And the government did not have the support of the people and ruled by decree, and von Braun's father was a Minister of Agriculture and may have helped smooth his way into getting this dissertation support. And then when a new coalition government was formed in January 1933 with Hitler as the chancellor, the conservatives were desperate to find enough support to continue, and the only way they could figure out to do it was try to use the Nazis, which was a fatal mistake. Because Hitler and the Nazis turned right around, and took over and betrayed the old conservative elite and established a dictatorship. Von Braun's father was out of a job, so von Braun's statement was, the whole Nazi takeover, I hardly even noticed it except my father lost his job. It just happened in the spring of 33. The Nazis came in. Von Braun just kind of was still a student. He was still at the university, and he was just trying to get through these experiments with rocketry in the Army Proving Ground at Kummersdorf, which is sort of the equivalent of Aberdeen. His attitude to the Nazis, I think, was partly inherited from his background. His conservative upbringing was skepticism or aristocratic snobbery about these lower class toughs that were in these, you know, people who were in the leadership of the Nazi Party. But on the other hand, he didn't care about Weimar democracy. The Weimar Republic seemed to be bankrupt, and it didn't really bother him that the Weimar Republic was essentially taken over from the inside and turned into a totalitarian dictatorship. He gradually accommodated himself to the Third Reich and became comfortable in it over time. You know, he was in a SS student writing unit. It was a SS had a SS Reitersturm I in Berlin, and the SS was interested in the aristocracy because they saw themselves as the aristocracy or the leadership, the future leadership of the Nazi Party. And so he was in this SS unit in 33, 34. As far as I can tell, it was only because at that point, the student bodies were being pressured to demonstrate their loyalty by joining one Nazi paramilitary organization or another. And when his PhD, when his doctorate finished in the summer of 34, he dropped out of it. He became party member then in 1937. And when he was already at this new rocket center at Peenemünde. So maybe at that point I should stop the narrative because I think you come to more questions about that.
Yeah, you've gotten us already to 1937 and to Peenemünde. That year, von Braun's rocket team will relocate to a secret laboratory there on Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea. So one of the things you really go into some detail about, Mike, is the technological breakthroughs from 1937 forward that von Braun and his team do. Could you take us through these?
So I mean, I think the context for this is between 1932, when he started out with like this, just a student with one assistant, trying to struggle at that point to develop a liquid propellant rocket engine that didn't burn itself up or blow up. He made some progress in those years. He gained a few more people. The Army helped him. In 1934, they launched a rocket which they called the A2. The A1 was so A for aggregate was a kind of code name for these rockets, and the second one, first one they gave up on, the second one it launched. So, you know, he had this kind of preliminary work developing rockets. But, you know, at this point, German rocketry, which was done in the deepest secrecy, because Becker was obsessed with this idea that we would essentially develop it as a black program and launch a surprise attack, was not much better than where Robert Goddard was in the United States and where the Soviets also began, when Sergei Korolev began working around the same years for the Red Army. Everybody had these rocket engines that developed a few hundred pounds of thrust that might take an object up a few thousand feet at best. And hardly any guidance systems of any description whatsoever that worked. So as the Third Reich began investing more and more money in this technology, you know, in 1935, the Army made an alliance with the new Luftwaffe, and the two services decided to form a joint rocket institute at Peenemünde on an island in the Baltic, and that would jointly develop rockets engines for. The Army wanted a ballistic missile, and the Air Force was obviously looking at rocket airplanes, maybe a rocket interceptor, and possibly other missile applications at the time. This alliance didn't work out that well, and the two sides of Peenemünde became independent. But von Braun was brought to Peenemünde in the summer of 37. At age 25, he already had 400 people working for him. And that was just a sign of his sort of natural ability to command respect, to demonstrate his ability to manage large numbers of people. I mean, what was his real genius was managing scientists and engineers to try radically new things and to bring often a set of prima donnas together and get them to work together and to establish what new things we could do, with the existing technology. And it was during these years, particularly between about 1936 and 1941, that the Germans made a huge leap in technological development of liquid propellant rocketry. And it's really in The Rocket and the Reich, an earlier book, that I outline this technological revolution. 3 major technologies involved in that. Just the first one that had always been the primary problem for most groups, large liquid propellant rocket engine. Not something that developed 100 pounds of thrust or 400 pounds of thrust, but something that developed, in the case of the V2, 55,000 pounds of thrust. So a huge leap, an orders of magnitude leap in the capability in liquid propellant rocket engines. And that engine just not only had to produce that thrust, as I said, it had to not self-destruct. The second challenge, which they really had to start thinking about after 1936 with the founding of Peenemünde and the building of this new facility, was supersonic aerodynamics. How are you going to have a projectile that's now going to travel in supersonic speeds? What form does the missile take, in order to travel at those speeds and be stable and can be guided? And so that Peenemünde was involved in this kind of ground floor in developing supersonic wind tunnels in Germany, which was also that the German Air Force was investing massive amounts of money at this point in this kind of supersonic aerodynamics and the most modern technologies. And then the third area was guidance and control, and that was really the most complicated and the most difficult challenge. It's one thing to develop a rocket that can go fast and go far. How are you actually going to hit anything? How are you going to guide that thing? The answer was obviously you need some kind of gyroscopic system to stabilize the missile and to try to guide it on a trajectory. But there's a long, complicated story you could get into. It's not in this book so much as it is in The Rocket and the Reich. But yeah, they had a lot of challenges, a lot of failures. And the first missile with a guidance, or the first test rocket with a guidance system, A3, was a total failure in 1937. And then they had to develop another test rocket before the A5 because they'd already assigned the number A4 to their first ballistic missile. There were plans for later, bigger, longer-range ballistic missile, but the first ballistic missile, which we now know as the V2, was called the A4. And his commander, General Dornberger, who was really the other key personality in this whole story, the other key leadership personality was General Walter Dornberger, said, your objective is to create a missile that can go 270 kilometers, about 175 miles, and hit a target accurately, and is of the correct size to fit on a standard German railroad flat car and go through German railroad tunnels. So that actually limited the fin size and the shape of the missile. So you put it on a flatbed car and get it through a standard German railroad tunnel. So the warhead would be 1 ton. And so the whole technological revolution at Peenemünde was fundamentally about trying to get through to that basic objective with the first, what was supposed to be just the first ballistic missile of much bigger and more even they began thinking about intercontinental range ballistic missile of multi-stages in the more distant future.
Yeah, that's one of the things, like your work points to, is that they were talking about, this is going forward, obviously we're getting into World War II itself now, but even thinking about rockets could eventually hit New York City, Washington, D.C., et cetera. This is after 1941, but you've already kind of set the stage for us to get into World War II with these next few questions. I think something the audience is really wanting to hear from you about, which is this A4V2, how this came about during the war. Something that people always are curious about, the impact of the British raid on Peenemünde in August of '43, and then your views, Mike, about how militarily impactful, was the V2? It's first used in September '44. So a few things in here
Yeah.
with this question.
Let me just, since I forgot to advance any pictures here. This is a picture showing here on the left, von Braun at Kummersdorf in 1934. Hitler is in the front row, and von Braun is up in the middle of the top. And I don't know how easy, you can't probably see it at this scale. And von Braun on the right in 1938 wearing the Nazi Party badge on his lapel pin. So this is all part of his sort of seduction and greasing engagement by the Third Reich. And I should add to this, which I hadn't mentioned before, is that in 1940 he became an SS officer. And Heinrich Himmler, who's in this picture, being given a tour at Peenemünde in 1943, in 1940 had spotted, has a potential, and he had been, as I said, for about a year, officially a SS candidate. And so von Braun was essentially pushed to join the SS as an officer. He said, I don't know if I really have any time for this, and Dornberger said, you better do this. We need to protect the priorities of the program. It was a point at which Hitler was skeptical. On the left, you see the V2 missile, actually in the early test series in 1942 or 1943, being prepared for launch. And so von Braun was sort of drawn into it. And in the book, my argument is that he essentially makes a Faustian bargain with the Third Reich, without even realizing he's making a Faustian bargain. I mean, he's so young, he's so successful, he's such a great manager. From the Nazi standpoint as well, he was blonde, blue-eyed, he was like this living Aryan. He was the perfect Aryan. And he was incredibly successful. And so they wanted to make sure that he was integrated in the Reich. And it was important, I think, for his career, obviously, that he protect that career by joining the party and then joining the SS, even though he didn't feel a burning commitment to it. I would say about his ideology that he was very adapted to the Third Reich. He believed in it. He believed in Hitler. But there's not really any evidence that he was really interested in race ideology or anti-Semitism. But he certainly lived in that environment and didn't think about it, and didn't care much. So the V2 became this huge problem in World War II for them because, well, they'd had all this development. They'd been pretty successful, but now they had to produce a missile. They had to produce something that was actually going to be deployed, rather than, we're not, Dornberger and Becker, saying basically, we can experiment, but at some point, we're now in a war. When are we going to produce something that actually could be used by the army and actually deployed in a war? So the pressure was on to accelerate the development of the A4, which was then named Vergeltungswaffe 2, Vengeance Weapon Number 2, only in the propaganda campaign in the fall of '44. But I just, for ease of understanding, I'll just always call it the V2. So the pressure was on to develop that. And then there was accelerated development. There was priority problems with Hitler. Dornberger makes a lot out of that. I don't think that was that important to changing the development course. The problem was that even though there was this breakthrough in key technologies and a real leap in the level of technological level of liquid propellant rocketry, far ahead of anywhere else in the world, it was a big difference between having an experimental missile and experimental rocket and having a missile that could be deployed in the field with a real warhead. And fired multiple times. And so it was a real struggle to get to the development stage where you could say, this thing's actually going to work, it's actually deployable, troops can actually handle it and fire it. So that was a real challenge. A key thing, and I think it was this rocket, is the test of October 1942, the third V2 launch was finally successful in going long distance, and that was a key breakthrough because at this point now, Albert Speer was the armaments minister, went to Hitler and said, we should go forward, we should have mass production, we should go into mass production. Well, it really was very premature, but the pressure of the war was on, and when you get to this, exactly to this period, 1942 into 1943, this is actually really the turning point of the war. So in November 1942, almost simultaneously, you have the British victory at Al Alamein in North Africa, and Allied landings in U.S. and British landings in Morocco and Algeria. Then you have the Stalingrad in the east, and the war is obviously turning bad. And Hitler is sort of seizing on the idea of a V weapon, and of a vengeance weapon, of a terror weapon. And so the army is anxious to sell him that idea. And so at the same time, the Luftwaffe, feeling left out and worried by the Army's development, developed another missile called the which was later called the V1 because it was deployed first, the Buzz Bomb. That was a cruise missile based on a primitive jet engine. So you had two V weapons coming up. And Hitler was now grasping at straws to some extent and was interested in accelerating the program. And so in the summer of 43, or in the spring of 43, some key decisions were made, including that they were never going to find a workforce of German skilled workers to build these things. Let's use concentration camp labor. So this fundamental decision was made in the spring of 43, before the British air raid, of using concentration camp labor. And then on August 17, 18, 1943, RAF, after the British had discovered the V2 program through aerial photography of Peenemünde, carried out a massive air raid on Peenemünde with the aim of destroying the science and engineering housing complex and killing as many science and engineers as possible. This raid was just a bit off, and most of the bombs fell to the south and actually killed a lot of forced laborers rather than the scientists. The program had a setback. They had to reorganize, and one of the reorganizations was, we have to take the production of the missile underground into an underground plant and send the concentration camp workers to work there, or the assembly workers, because there were actually still concentration camp workers all over the Reich that were working on the V2 program.
You've already alluded here, Mike, to the concentration camp system now being tied into producing these rockets. That decision being made in the spring of 1943. Again, just a kind of reminder to our audience who controls the concentration camp system. It's the SS in this case. This is the part of von Braun's career that, especially in the 1980s, became a lot more attention brought to this. What do you want to say about what von Braun knew and his involvement with this slave labor aspect of the V2?
So, this is a difficult and complicated question. And I could easily go on for 10 minutes, but obviously I'm going on long enough as it is. I think von Braun is not one of the key decision makers. It's not his decision to use concentration camp labor. That's above his head. He's not the one promoting the idea, although one of his key associates, Arthur Rudolph, who was at that point son of the leading engineer on the production plant side, but who was one who came to the United States and later became the subject of of being sent out of the United States. Anyway, Arthur Rudolph was an advocate of concentration camp, so von Braun knew about it. He was well acquainted with what was going on. He would have seen concentration camp workers at factory facilities, so he's not ignorant of it. The real thing happens is when they go underground. So they go to these tunnels that had been there before, using as a storage dump for chemical weapons and ammunition and oil. And strategic oil and chemical weapons dump was cleared out. They started building a factory in the tunnels. The concentration camp workers were originally housed in the tunnels, which was a catastrophe. Thousands died, and 6,000 died in the winter of 43, 44, doing this horrendous conditions. Von Braun was in the tunnels. He walked through the tunnels. He saw the prisoners. He saw what was going on. He knew what was happening. I think a little of his alienation from the Reich certainly started then. But that was something he was engaged. And so in some ways he's a very interesting case because he's not his idea. He's not somebody who's enthusiastic about this. He maybe even thinks it's a bad idea, but he continues to do his job, and his job included at points writing documents that said, there was an engine test site in a quarry that was 100 kilometers to the south, and he had to write a memo saying, in order to do this, in order to save German labor, we need X number of concentration camp workers at that place. He was involved with decision-making, about concentration camp workers in the tunnels. And a very interesting case that I wrote about in the book and in an article that I wrote, he also, at one point, tried to intervene on behalf of a French physicist who was working in the tunnels. So you see negative and positive with von Braun, and my argument has always been, basically, he's not the worst guy, but he is in the system. He's part of a system. He's a part of a system that's exploiting and murdering prisoners. And you just, we can argue about whether he had any choice, whether it was a totalitarian society, could he do anything? That's a good question, an entirely legitimate question, whether it's fair to hold him accountable for this or not. But he was part of a system that was doing this. And so that is certainly part of the story that after the war was suppressed for decades and really only came out like 30 years after the end of World War II.
Well, Mike, we have like about 5 minutes before we turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jeremy Collins. I think I'm going to just combine a couple of kind of big questions to wrap up my part of this. You've already alluded to the fact that von Braun becomes disillusioned with the Nazis increasingly later in the war, like a lot of people from his background. We think about the conservatives involved in the July 20th plot in 1944. He is captured, of course, by the Americans at the end of the war, and something that everybody wants to know about is this Project Paperclip, where he's brought over. So this is my kind of twofold thing, and then turn it over to Jeremy, is how do you view this as an unending controversy about Project Paperclip and the American decision to bring many of these German engineers and scientists over? And what would you say by way of like some overall assessment of von Braun and the Nazi regime that you'd want to leave us with?
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions there because obviously I talked too much in the earlier part. So I used up a lot of time, but there's so much interesting, fascinating, and important detail there. I would say, his disillusionment comes in part because of the concentration camp periods. It particularly comes because he's actually arrested by the Gestapo in the spring of '44. Is held for 10 days, and under the accusation of some drunken remarks at a party that he made about they were going to lose the war and they really want to build a spaceship. So there's some evidence there of his space. His ongoing obsession with space and going to the moon, and the book really makes the point of going to the moon was always his personal obsession. He gets out of the war partly through a lot of luck. After the war, he depicted him making these independent decisions, but in many ways, at this point in the war, the last year of the war, the V2 program was very much in control of the SS. And von Braun was now viewed as suspect because he'd been arrested. And though Speer and Dornberger managed to get him out. And so, he gets through the end of the war partly by putting on a show of being an SS officer. And actually in this picture on the right, he's actually in the back in a black SS uniform. And I just have some pictures here about the concentration camp workers and about the end of the war here and his surrender to the Americans. He surrenders to the U.S. in May the 2nd, 1945 in the Bavarian Austrian Alps, actually in the Austrian side of the line, in the Austrian Alps. After he was evacuated twice, he had a terrible car accident. There's this massive cast in this picture from a terrible car accident. They survived the war, and the question is, now what? What are we going to do? And immediately the German leader, the Dornberger and von Braun said, we've got to defect to the Americans. They have the money, the British and French don't. We don't trust them. We're mortally afraid of the Soviets. And partly through luck and partly through design, they end up surrendering to the U.S. Army. And so the end of the war, the question is for all of the great powers was, what do we do with this legacy of German science and technology? Contrary to a lot of later mythologies, the Germans weren't ahead of everybody in everything. In fact, they were behind us in radar. They were way behind in nuclear weapons. But in rocket and jet technology, they had advantages. So the Soviets, the US, the French, the British all moved in to try to grab people and equipment and technology. The US program was called Overcast, then was changed the name to Paperclip, was a program to bring science engineers to the United States, which turned into a program of permanent immigration, not its original design, but it turned into an immigration program. And I would say my overall assessment of this is that the United States had to do this just like the other powers. There was a competition. And the real question was, did we do a good enough job filtering out some of the people who shouldn't have come over? Von Braun wasn't the worst. I mean, there was doctors involved with concentration camp experiments, and there were other things going on. So, and there are people in von Braun's orbit who were certainly more implicated than he was. And so, Paperclip is another story that tends to be black and white. Either it was a terrible thing that we did, or it was a great thing that we did, but, this complexity is taken out of it. And I think overall, yeah, it was an important thing for Cold War missile and rocket and jet and a lot of other technologies that we used German labor, just like the Soviets did, just like the British and French did. But, maybe we could have had a better filter on that program in terms of keeping people out. So the scandals that were revealed in the 80s were mostly about a few people out of over 1,000 that were brought over. Von Braun was obviously one of the controversies that took place.
Well, Mike, let me thank you for a wonderful conversation. It is much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jeremy, please.
Thank you both, gentlemen. If you have questions, audience members, please raise your hand. We will start to your right, towards the back.
Thank you, Dr. Neufeld. I really learned a lot this past hour. But I have a question about Paperclip. In the 1983 movie, The Right Stuff, they talk, our Germans are better than their Germans. I'd like to know how much filtering did he have in that process? Did he know names? Did he pull certain people over to the American program and play? What role did he play, or did he play one at all?
Well, he played a role in his select group. So one of the fallacies of people often understanding Paperclip is that somehow Paperclip equals the Von Braun group. So, out of the total Paperclip program, the Von Braun group was maybe 15, 20% total out of this. And the Air Force actually brought over more people than the Army. And the Navy brought people, and the Commerce Department brought a few. So it was a much bigger program than Von Braun's role. Basically, was when he linked up basically with General Holger, or at that time Colonel Holger Toftoy, of Army Ordnance, who was assigned essentially, Army Ordnance wanted to figure out, okay, how do we get a hold of German rocket technology, and what do we make out of it? And so when here in this right-hand picture, he's with Toftoy's in the middle, and Major Jim Hamill, who was his direct superior, Von Braun's direct superior, and they went to Fort Bliss. So because I talked in detail about the Second World War period, we never got to Von Braun's American career. But Von Braun spent 15 years of his life in the Army, actually. He worked for the U.S. Army longer than he ever worked for NASA, from 1945 to 1960. And in the selection process, to answer your actual question, the selection process in Germany, was, okay, what kind of group do you need to have the key specialists? And he said, well, I need, these propulsion guys, and I need these guidance and control people, somebody from aerodynamics and somebody from manufacturing, and, so it was a selection process. But the other side of this was that he wanted 500 people. And the Army said, you're not getting 500 people, or they probably told him, we would like to have you get 500 people, but the Pentagon in Washington is not going to allow that. So he only got about 125 and at the beginning, and they went to not White Sands, they were helping American engineers and General Electric and the Army launch V-2s in White Sands, but they were actually based at Fort Bliss in El Paso. And they were at Fort Bliss from 1945 to 1950. but there was no money in the post-war environment, and they were really short-handed. And he wanted to bring more people over, and a few more. He got a few more of the key people over in the later 40s, but only a handful of people. So he really felt they felt underfunded and neglected after the kind of money that had been lavished on them by the Nazis. They felt really shortchanged. And when they went to Huntsville in 1950, the Cold War was taking off, and then they started getting better funding.
We've got a question in the back to your left, gentlemen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neufeld, for this very interesting presentation. I would call sometimes him an opportunist, because
Yes.
he was also under observance of the SD.
Mm-hmm.
And could you elaborate a little bit more about his, it's not loyalty, but I have sometimes the feeling that he just used every opportunity to continue researching.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter which system.
Mm-hmm.
If you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, you've hit on a sort of key question about how do you evaluate his behavior. He's been called an opportunist almost from the beginning of his fame in the United States, which really took off in the 50s when he was at Huntsville working for the Army, but he was already selling space travel. At that point, the Army had to present a biography of him, and an explanation of why we had him in his group. So he's been called an opportunist for a long time. My argument in the book is, it's more than just being an opportunist. He is loyal to this regime. He's enthusiastic. So the story presented in the 50s and after 60s was really, he had no choice. He was sort of trapped. He had to do he had to do it. He was not a Nazi. He was a nominal member of the party, but that was all. But the whole story of the SS was unknown. The story of the Mittelbau-Dora was completely suppressed or ignored or forgotten. It's a long story in itself. And so, this whole story of, I was just a scientist, I only want to do my job, I had to be kind of a party member because I had no choice. It was a totalitarian society. It was a totalitarian society, but there's no evidence that von Braun was bothered by that until he confronted it directly, particularly with his own arrest by the Gestapo. And I sort of argue in the book that he's made a Faustian bargain with the Third Reich because they gave him all the money and power that he wanted, all the technology he wanted to develop, as long as he did it their way for their purposes. And he woke up late in the war to the fact that this is the kind of regime I'm working for. And as Jason alluded to, part of it was the disillusionment that set in in general, as the Nazis were, had led Germany to these great victories, but now obviously Hitler was losing the war. So there was a general disillusionment, notably among the conservatives who had gone right along with the Nazis, willingly in many cases. So you hit right on a really important question. How do we evaluate him? And I've always said there is no writing. I'm not going to sit here and say, this is what you have to think about that, because it is arguable. How much do we take into account the fact he's living in a totalitarian society where the secret police can snap you up, as actually happened to him eventually in 44? And how much do you think of this as willing? And as I said, all the evidence was he was a loyal member of the regime. He was a Nazi of a kind, and he believed in Hitler. And a lot of people believed in Hitler because Hitler had accomplished all these great things, and they were willing to overlook the obvious genocide that was happening around them, because they were having one victory after another.
Next question is going to be to your right, towards the back.
Mm-hmm.
Enjoyed your talk very much. Quick question that kind of drags in popular culture. I assume you're familiar with Tom Lehrer's song,
Oh,
Wernher von
absolutely.
Braun. That was, I think, 1965. So relatively early on, he was under some criticism, was he not? Also, the movie Dr. Strangelove obviously takes a jab at him. Would you like to?
Yeah, in the 60s he became, so in the 50s, partly that reflected the serious Cold War environment and the way the Army had, U.S. Army had packaged him, you know, in order, and he had packaged himself to be acceptable. That was fine. In the 60s, the culture obviously changed. There was more criticism of him. I mean, you know, the two most famous jokes about him. First was Mort Saul. You know, when Hollywood did a movie about him called I Aim at the Stars, which was really bad, actually. And it's really hard to even get a hold of this movie, it's so bad. But in the middle of the movie, I Am at the Stars, and Mort Saul said, it should have been subtitled, but sometimes I hit London. and you know, couple years after that, Tom Lehrer, who had become famous as a kind of musical comedy guy, was singing, had made this satirical song about Wernher von Braun. When the rockets go up, who knows where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. So, you know, he hit the mark in some ways about von Braun, but it's notable that the criticism in the 60s, this criticism basically came from liberals, from Jewish people and others who had reason to be skeptical about von Braun, was all about him being an opportunist. And the whole story of him being involved with Nazi war crimes really doesn't even get into the American public media until the 80s. So it's 20 years later after. But yeah, I used to when I did this as a lecture, which I did for a lot of years as a book talk, I used to start with the Lehrer song. It was an entertaining way to begin. And I actually got to talk to Tom Lehrer as part of the research. So the real story of Tom Lehrer, he was a math professor who had a career of a few years, made himself famous and wealthy doing this musical comedy, and then he said, I'm not doing that anymore, and went back to being a math professor. And he lived alternately, and he spent fall semester in MIT and the spring semester at UC Santa Cruz. It was very obscure for a long time until the New York Times went out and found him again. But anyway.
Dr. Neufeld, to
Yes.
your left here, I've got my own question.
Sure.
1969, 2023. How is von Braun seen in West Germany then and Germany now?
So, yeah, it's a very astute question about that, because in the 60s, von Braun was a national hero, at least in West Germany, you know, because he was our local boy makes good. You know, now Germany's divided, and West Germany is an American ally, and here's von Braun and his Germans are making a great contribution, and we didn't even really have time to get to the whole space race and Apollo and everything else. So von Braun is a hero in West Germany, but in East Germany, you know, in the communist third really of Germany, the East Germans set out to tear him down. And they did a movie in response to I Am at the Stars called Frozen Lightning, which was about Peenemünde and Dora. It never got any circulation in the West to speak of, and they had very little luck tearing down von Braun's reputation. But in the 70s and later, then, as you get into more scholarship and more knowledge about what went on, you know, German opinions started to change, and it partly reflected also the generational change from the World War II generation who ran West Germany. They didn't want to talk about the crimes and all of what happened, and everything was the fault of Hitler and a small coterie of Nazis, and nobody else was guilty. And in the 70s, in the 70s and 80s, as the new generation of people comes up, and my generation, sort of the same age group of my generation come up, questioning the radicalism of the students in the 60s and 70s. So yeah, the whole attitude changed, and I found that, you know, in Germany now, there's a lot of people are harder on him in the memory of von Braun than they are in the United States. Especially coming in a space museum, aerospace museum, and working with people in NASA and everything else a lot, you know, a lot of people still want to revert to the space race era view of von Braun. And Germany, where they've gone through that hard process of coming to responsibility for their own guilt, for the genocide, for the Holocaust, for everything else, the inclination, at least among the better educated, is more critical.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Jason Dawsey and Dr. Michael Neufeld.
Thank you. happy to answer more questions afterwards, as we sign books or whatever.
So thank you, Jason and Michael. Michael will be signing copies of von Braun at the signing table behind you. How fun is that? Please mark your calendars for 2 upcoming events. So next Thursday at 6 p.m., we'll be opening our latest special exhibition, The Gopher Broke Spirit, Legacy and Portraits, where we'll be joined by the photographer whose work makes up the exhibit and by a veteran of the fabled 442 Regimental Combat Team, Yoshio Nakamura. So Gopher Broke, pretty cool opportunity. And then August 11th, we'll host our next Meet the Author event featuring Colonel Retired Greg Fontenot, who'll be here speaking about the Big Red One. His book is No Sacrifice Too Great, the 1st Infantry Division in World War II. So thank you all for being here tonight. And let's give Dr. Michael Neufeld and Jason one more round of applause.
Good
Thank
job,
you.
Mike.
Thanks, everybody.